You think you make logical decisions with your money, the data suggests otherwise. Let's run the numbers. A potentially useful financial option can lose attention simply because it appears difficult. Complexity can discourage participation before actual understanding is tested. That tension opens a puzzle about structure rather than personal failure. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. More features may increase choice while reducing confidence. The answer begins by examining the route around the choice, not only the outcome. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. A simple option can win because it is easier to compare and complete. This makes the surrounding sequence part of the decision itself. The outcome is not predetermined. Now the mystery is why capability does not consistently translate into engagement. The contrast matters because preference and completion are not identical. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Perceived burden can matter even when the underlying task is manageable. We can investigate the pattern while allowing responses to differ across contexts. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Long menus can create uncertainty about which differences matter. The result can look like weak discipline even when the pathway carries much of the burden. Individual circumstances can change the result. Technical language can make ordinary decisions feel specialized. This creates a practical gap between wanting an outcome and reaching it. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Several reasonable options can delay action by increasing comparison work. That distinction prevents us from treating every incomplete action as a revealed preference. This requires a careful comparison. Unclear procedures can make postponement feel safer than error. Inspect the choice architecture. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. Complexity can conceal costs as easily as it can conceal benefits. Seen this way, the obstacle belongs partly to the environment. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Avoidance may reflect design burden rather than lack of interest. The practical stakes appear when the same intention repeatedly meets the same barrier. The surrounding context still matters. Choice complexity includes option count, unfamiliarity, sequencing, and uncertainty. Used carefully, the concept explains a pathway rather than declaring a fixed trait. Individual circumstances can change the result. Cognitive load refers to the mental work required to hold and compare information. This framing preserves room for rational choice, changing circumstances, and individual variation. The distinction remains important. Choice overload can occur when additional options reduce clarity rather than add value. The mechanism becomes clearer when the surrounding conditions are named explicitly. This requires a careful comparison. Complexity aversion describes avoidance when evaluation feels disproportionately demanding. A precise definition prevents the label from becoming an overbroad explanation. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Actual difficulty and perceived difficulty may differ. This definition keeps the analysis separate from moral judgment or guaranteed prediction. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Financial sophistication can reduce some burdens while leaving procedural friction intact. The distinction matters because adjacent mechanisms can produce similar visible outcomes. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. A simple interface can clarify or oversimplify depending on what it removes. It also allows a bounded explanation without claiming that everyone responds identically. Individual circumstances can change the result. Complexity should be reduced without hiding meaningful trade-offs. That boundary helps separate structural influence from personal preference. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Unfamiliar terminology can consume attention before the core choice is reached. The immediate experience may therefore outweigh a distant or less visible consideration. This requires a careful comparison. Too many dimensions make comparison unstable because priorities shift across criteria. Once repeated, the sequence can become easier to follow than to reconsider. The outcome is not predetermined. Nested decisions can turn one choice into a chain of unresolved sub-choices. The practical consequence depends on timing, clarity, and the cost of reversing course. The boundary should remain explicit. Fear of irreversible error can increase the cost of experimentation. This is one mechanism, not a complete explanation for every financial decision. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Interestingly, ambiguous next steps can prevent action even after an option is selected. The effect may strengthen when motivation is moderate and competing demands are present. Individual circumstances can change the result. Complexity can interact with risk perception because uncertainty feels more dangerous. A different environment could redirect the same intention through another sequence. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Defaults can simplify action while quietly steering selection. The relationship is conditional, which is why context must remain visible. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Chunking a process into stages can reduce burden without removing choice. The pathway matters because each stage can either preserve or drain momentum. The outcome is not predetermined. Curated option sets can improve clarity but may narrow autonomy. This helps explain why small design features can have cumulative consequences. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Examples can help only when they clarify principles rather than promise certainty. Defaults influence, they do not determine. The boundary should remain explicit. Individual circumstances can change the result. Comparability matters more than raw quantity of information. This step changes what receives attention before the final comparison is made. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. Standardized categories can reveal differences that decorative detail obscures. The next effect emerges because limited attention must be allocated somewhere. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Progressive disclosure can present essential information before advanced detail. That shift can alter completion while leaving the available options formally unchanged. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Reversible trial steps can reduce fear of committing incorrectly. The mechanism builds through several small demands rather than one dramatic event. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundaries should remain explicit. Good simplification preserves the decision's important boundaries. This creates a pathway from environment to action without implying inevitability. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Some complex instruments are appropriately avoided because their risks are difficult to assess. A rational explanation may fit better when real costs or new information are present. The surrounding context still matters. Simple products are not automatically inferior. This limit prevents the concept from becoming an excuse to ignore genuine preferences. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. Expertise can make complexity useful when additional features serve a real purpose. An intervention can help one person while making the process harder for another. The distinction remains important. Reducing complexity may shift power toward whoever chooses what remains visible. The design question must include autonomy, transparency, and who benefits. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Education can help, but design still matters when procedures remain burdensome. Removing burden is not automatically beneficial when reflection or protection is needed. The outcome is not predetermined. Different users need different levels of detail. These conditions mark the boundary between support and manipulation. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. The ethical question is whether simplification informs or steers. The mechanism remains useful only when competing explanations are considered. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. The answer is that complexity can deter participation by increasing perceived decision cost. The practical lesson follows from the route, not from blaming the chooser. Individual circumstances can change the result. Complexity does not prove an option is better or worse. This interpretation preserves both behavioral insight and rational exceptions. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. The distinction matters. Clear sequencing can separate learning from commitment. The final answer is therefore about alignment between intention and design. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Comparable summaries can make trade-offs easier to inspect. This resolves the opening puzzle without claiming that the environment dictates every choice. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Limiting the initial choice set can reduce overload while preserving deeper options. The conclusion is structural but still leaves room for agency and changing priorities. The boundary should remain explicit. Transparent defaults can support action without disguising alternatives. The decision can now be evaluated as a pathway rather than a single isolated moment. The surrounding context still matters. Reversible steps can encourage exploration without forcing commitment. That answer is stronger when stated conditionally instead of as a rule for every context. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. A useful design shows both the simple path and the advanced path. The mechanism explains influence, not destiny. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. The opening barrier resolves when perceived burden is treated as part of the product. The opening contrast becomes understandable once the hidden comparison point is exposed. This requires a careful comparison. Identify which terms, steps, or comparisons create the most uncertainty. The action remains bounded because different contexts may require different safeguards. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Separate essential decisions from optional customization. The aim is to make the pathway visible enough to evaluate deliberately. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Compare options using a small set of personally relevant criteria. That approach supports experimentation without promising a guaranteed financial result. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Delay advanced features until the basic choice is understood. Engineer the environment carefully. The outcome is not predetermined. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. Use reversible trials where consequences permit experimentation. Small revisions can be tested before they become fixed routines. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Ask what information was removed when a product is simplified. The test is whether the adjustment improves clarity while preserving meaningful choice. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Reject simplicity that hides cost, risk, or loss of control. A useful change should reduce avoidable burden without hiding trade-offs. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Choose the amount of detail that supports judgment rather than performance. This turns the concept into a review process rather than a single prescription for every context. The boundary should remain explicit. The goal is not maximal simplicity, but understandable complexity. The useful lesson is to inspect the environment before judging the chooser. Don't fight your brain, engineer your environment. See you next time.